Hi, I'm Catherine Ayers-Wickenhauser, Director of Communications at Direct Trust. And I'm so excited today to be joined by Dan Kazzaz, CEO of Secure Exchange Solutions, who has recently been named one of our interoperability heroes. Dan, welcome. Will you introduce yourself and tell us more about Secure Exchange Solutions too?
Thank you very much for including me in this quarter's Interop Hero class. I am truly honored. A little bit about me. Believe it or not, I started programming in 1968. In 1977, I started working with startups, either with others or in my own companies. I started focusing on B2B e-commerce in the early 1980s. So in addition to working in startups, I also participated in various standards development organizations, including Direct Trust. Along the way, I connected with some truly outstanding individuals. From this group of amazing people, we created an incredible team. This team, while supporting standards, which is, by the way, the easiest way to create a scalable company, created the highly successful Secure Exchange Solutions. SES today now handles roughly 50 million messages per month. It leads the market in several important areas. We are integrated into over 100 electronic medical record systems, 1,500 hospitals, 400,000 providers, over 60 HIEs, 10 large players, and the list goes on. SES offers robust HISP services, very sophisticated message routing and conversion. This includes routing ADT notifications and CCDs based on patient demographics and other criteria. SES is likely the largest automated chart retrieval and evaluation vendor. All of these products use the direct and other standards in very scalable and creative ways.
Well, thank you for providing that background. It's incredible to hear about the different ways that you're using direct secure messaging and the success that you're having too. And you mentioned 1968, and I know, maybe interoperability hasn't been around quite that long, but you mentioned that you were there kind of at the start of interoperability. And so I'm curious if you can describe, knowing your longevity in interoperability, if you can describe cross-industry interoperability and why it's important.
Great question. Thanks for asking. I think the best way to illustrate this might be just to look at healthcare. So people think of healthcare as just one industry, but it's really several industries. For example, health insurance companies are one industry, hospitals and clinics are another industry, pharmacies are yet another industry. Now, if you look at what insurance companies need, because they're the ones who are generally paying for clinical services, right? What do they need in order to accurately pay for their members, pay for their members' services? They need to verify, of course, that the right item is paid for at the right amount. So in order to get this to truly work, you need to get the insurance companies and the clinicians working together to make this happen. But because they're separate industries, they've each joined separate standards organizations. So the interoperability between the payers and the providers on verification of the clinical information around payment is a problem. Now, we know this problem in several ways. We often call it the prior authorization problem, or the claim payment problem, but this problem at its core is really a problem that exists because there are multiple standards and each industry group is represented by another standard, and it's hard for them to really communicate. So now that isn't to say that one should drop one standard in favor of the others. They each have their own value add. They each have their own intellectual property or IP. So the challenge really that we face as an industry is how to get the SDOs to efficiently share their intellectual property. And if we could do that, the entire total industry would benefit greatly.
Thanks, Dan. And, thinking about all those different parts of healthcare that are out there, even within the health IT space, it is so interesting to think about the various aspects of interoperability. And, we just talked about cross-industry interop, but I'm curious maybe if we could take a second and zoom out and just talk about some of the key components of interoperability from your perspective. Could you describe, key components and what those are?
So there are two key components. And they fall into two very, very broad categories, one of which I will call content or metadata. And the other one is transport. So if you want to look at a very simple thing like web pages, right? www.directcross.org. What happens there? So you realize that the ability to serve up that visually pleasing thing to the human is really a combination of two standards. It's a standard called HTTP, which is part of the whole TCP/IP route as to how to get things in real time. And then there's another standard called HTML, which you all know and love, right? But that's really just basically a tag standard for how things are presented. So again, it's back to metadata and transport. So the metadata is basically tags and lists. And so what happens if we look at the earlier standards, let's say HL7 2.x and X12, they're both very similar. They each have a tag, which then tells you what the following set of information is. So for example, and they call these tags in their lingo segments. So in HL7 2.x, they call it a PD1, and that will hold the patient name. In HL7, they will have something called, in HL7 it's PD1, and X12, they'll have an NM1. NM1 can be a doctor name or patient name, and HL7, PD1 is strictly a patient name. And they delineate which of the fields, they have their fields separated by delimiters. So if you think about your CSV files, when you export a spreadsheet, so you have delimiters, which are usually commas in between your fields. So they have delimiters in between the fields, and then they order them. So the first field is family name, the second field is middle name, the third field is last name. In other standards like XML or JSON or those things, they'll actually have a long tag that says family name and then the name of the family, your last name, as it were. And then, of course, there are these other things called lists. So what's a list? So what happens is you'll have a metadata code called gender. And in the gender, it will have, okay, what is the gender of this person? And this is where you begin to see where standards need to constantly evolve. Today, if you look at HL7 and X12, they list male, female, unknown, and other as their standards. But we know that both in the clinical and administrative sense today, you need to have transgender male, transgender female, non-binary. You need a whole bunch of list of other gender codes baked back into the standard so things can be communicated effectively. Now, in terms of transport protocols, and really the only one which has created a reasonably secure standard, because there's lots of proprietary ways of communicating information securely or not, but the Direct Trust is the only SDO that has created a secure messaging standard. And so if you combine secure messaging and data content, you can get a very, very wide adoption. So what happened with the whole meaningful use bit is we combined the HL7 CCD and direct for how to move clinical information, push information from point A to point B. And that's how we got started in this particular phase of our lives.
And I think that's a great way to set the foundation for the background. And for someone who may not necessarily be technical, I think this is a great way to understand the different components of interoperability and how it all comes together and how it all works, and maybe even making sense of some of that alphabet soup that we're used to in health IT. And you mentioned at the end a little bit about transport and about the direct standard and how that came to be. And I know you were, to make a Hamilton reference, in the room where it happened when the direct standard was coming about, and looking at the foundation of different standards that ultimately became the direct standard. So I think looking back a little bit, looking to our past, can you describe why the ONC convened a group for clinical information interoperability? What drove them to do that?
Well, so all of this interoperability on a national level, because interoperability processes have been going on for a long time, but at a national level, the origin of this was something which came out of the recession in the early 2000s. So when President Barack Obama was elected, due to some things which the Republicans had initiated in the 90s, in the early years of the Barack Obama administration, Congress basically said, hey, we need to revive the economy. One of the ways we're going to revive the economy is we're going to take a lot of money and we're going to use this money to get EMRs, electronic medical records, into the hands of doctors and hospitals. Along that way, they said, oh, let's exchange the information also. So that's where you said interoperability and clinical information really started happening. They started the process by, again, funding health information exchanges, which would be local repositories of information, and everybody would contribute information in, and then everybody would pull from there as needed. Great idea, but a doctor from Massachusetts testified to Congress, and I think it was probably the NCVHS committee, the National Committee on Health and Vital Statistics. So he said, hey, look, I'm a doctor in Massachusetts. I'm using a particular EMR system. I'm referring a patient to a doctor I know in LA who's using the same electronic medical record system I am. Why can't I just email that doctor this patient's record? And that's when, lights went off and said, wait a minute, we've got this, this kind of retrieval system, but we don't have a way to just push the information from point A to point B. And that's what caused ONC to convene a group on top of what they'd already done with the HIE standards to say, let's create a standard for push messaging. And to date, Direct Trust, and I shouldn't hate to do this, but really, Direct Trust is really the only organization that has developed a push standard so that you can get information out to the appropriate party at the appropriate time.
You're right, and I think it's for a lot of people to walk down memory lane to talk about meaningful use, and now hindsight 2020, we know what the successes were with meaningful use and how we got to today, but we also know where maybe there were some opportunities for improvement. But again, kind of staying in the past for a moment and looking back to how this all came to be with push messaging and having a standard for push messaging. Can you describe more about why and how the particular standards were selected?
Sure. So what ended up happening was a group was formed by ONC, and that group consisted of very, very significant vendors inside of healthcare: SureScripts, Change, Cerner, Siemens. Everybody was there. Epic. All these groups were represented, including Microsoft. And so the group of us got together. And I was lucky enough to be invited. And they got together and they talked about various kinds of ways where we might do this, including secure the text messaging layer, including the same layer that you access web pages on. Well, the challenge was, well, if I'm going to push information from point A to point B has to be listening all the time. And if you're going to be moving messages around, you want the software that everybody has at their fingertips to be able to deal with it. So it turns out that some of the key components inside of Direct, which is the ability to deal with certificates for signing and encryption, well, those are already embedded in all the email clients. And so basically everybody said, hey, listen, why don't we just use email transport, because the email servers are always up and running. Everybody's making sure when was the last time you actually lost an email, right? That emails generally get delivered from point A to point B. It may not be the quickest thing in the world. It may not be able to send huge files, but it's always there. And then the other piece, which was really critical to the thinking, is that, well, this can be used not just for doctor to doctor, doctor to insurance company to insurance company, but it can also be used for patient messaging. And that was one of the big points, even though we haven't yet really figured out how to do it with patient messaging with direct or anything else for that matter. But be able to scale all the way down to in the individual was another key reason why direct trust was, or SMTP was, and with certificates was designed as the way to go. Now, this standard of using SMTP with certificates was a standard that was developed by the Internet Engineering Task Force back in the 90s. So it already been around for quite a while by the time we all met and picked it to use for direct.
And what's so fascinating to me, Dan, is to think about present day and even the unimaginable things that we've encountered over the last 2 years, and how direct secure messaging, which happens because of the direct standard, is so adaptable as a transport mechanism. And there are new use cases happening all the time. So to think back to that conversation, which happened, I think in the late 2000s, right? That it's incredible that the decisions that were made at that time are still so adaptable, and still, we're learning and doing new things because of those decisions that were made at that time in that room. And of course, Direct Trust is proud to be the custodian of that direct standard today. And so thinking about some of those use cases and the adaptability of the transport protocol and the standard, I'm curious for your perspective here. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the past, but thinking about the future, and in particular, the 21st Century Cures Act. How do you see that direct secure messaging can help address some of the components in the 21st Century Cures Act?
And let me just distinguish two things. Like one is kind of direct trust in terms of the set of standards that we have today, and maybe some augmentation on top of that, which we might address later. But there are two key components which are really important for the 21st Century Cures Act. One is the ability to do effective patient messaging. And it has to be two-way communication, but even one way, even sending messages out to patients via direct will be a great way to get started. And this was something which had been initiated in the early versions of ONC standards. We called it Blue Button. But that patient messaging, patient member interaction over direct is really, really important. And the reason it's important is that what happens today is that you might have access to your insurance company information from your insurance company, so portal for them. You might have another app or portal for your lab, like Quest or LabCorp. You might have another one for your primary care physician, another one for here. So you have like 15 different apps in order to try to get your healthcare information. And you have to go click on each one and have it log in, get the information. And by the way, there's no consolidation. So, what if you're going to try to get to something that you could generally use, you want to not only have the ability to go query it and come back, but also have it push things to you. Like, gee, you need to remember that you have a doctor's appointment, or the doctor might want to message you with an appointment automatically based on your lab result that they want you in right away. So the ability to message things back and forth, and it's been an area where Secure Exchange Solutions has been particularly successful, is that we've been helping insurance companies communicate with the providers that are seeing their members. So if we can help the insurance companies communicate with their members directly, help the providers communicate with their members directly, that will save everybody a ton of money. The other area in 21st Century Cures is the insurance company to insurance company exchange of information. So right now, if you're not using direct, getting a secure communication path between any 2 points is a real pain in the neck. And what happened when we created direct in the first place, which was really a genius move by one of the contributors from Microsoft, we said, hey, let's use the same method we have for getting an IP number from a URL. So in other words, like when you go www.directtrust.org, what happens is that there's a lookup table. that is stored around all the major servers in the world. and it comes back with a number that says, here is the actual physical address of the server that's holding directtrust.org's webpage. We put in we said, oh, there's a certificate capability on that. So why don't we use that to get the certificate so that we can have a secure connection instantly at any time. So, and I mention that because there are just as many insurance companies as there are hospitals, maybe more. So in order to have easy connectivity that is secure, you need a mechanism like Direct Trust in order to get the certificates established for that piece. So in summary, the two areas where Direct Trust can help in 21st century cures is patient/member communication and payer communication. Those are the areas where if the industry would focus in, we could actually make some progress.
Sure. And I love that we've covered so many different stakeholders within healthcare too. You know, so often we're talking about clinician to clinician exchange, but really when it comes down to it and the opportunity and the pathways that exist already, you know, there is the ability for patients to get a direct address. And so expanding that and expanding that opportunity for communication certainly addresses the 21st Century Cures Act, and you know, very interested in how direct can be used in payer-to-payer communication as well. So thank you for outlining that and describing that. And you know, so 21st Century Cures Act has been a hot topic recently, but there are also many other things that are happening within the health IT space. And I'm curious if you might have any ideas outside of the 21st Century Cures Act, how direct can help the health IT industry or the healthcare industry as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the key issue, a key issue about what happened with direct was identity proofing and assigning of certificates. So certificates, as you may or may not know, well, we use it for encryption and for signing when we're using just kind of direct messaging, but the way it's used inside of direct is just to sign the whole message so that the receiver of the message knows that it was generated by the sender. There's no reason to limit that signing to the whole message. We could sign a portion of a message and keep that signed portion of the message inside the message. So who leverages that technology all the time? Blockchain, right? So you know, if you believe that blockchain is really good technology, then signing a little piece of data is really good technology. Now, why is signing the data important, and why can Direct Trust, or why should Direct Trust, can Direct Trust help in this? So here's the issue for everybody on the provider side. What happens is that the doctor has to sign things for the patient in order for somebody to get reimbursed, either the doctor, or it might be the ambulance driver, or it might be the hospital bed provider, but they end up with this whole process of signing documents. And they actually also have to sign the charts. So if there is a one-click way for them to sign the charts, and that signature is verifiable, just like it is with blockchain, right? Then we can take this infrastructure that was started with Direct Trust and apply it to the whole signature process. And CMS has a rule that says we want to minimize the amount of work that doctors have to do to sign things. We want to minimize the overhead. So we want to simplify it as much as possible. So a certificate that is assigned, that is used by the doctor, which could be for signing, and referenced by their EMR vendors or whatever tools they have, would be tremendously useful to be able to sign these documents. It would save the doctors a lot. And at the other side is that it would also cut down on fraud, waste, and abuse, right? The big issue that everybody who pays the bill worries about. So they could actually verify the signature of the documents coming in to know that this was indeed done by a licensed physician. So it's the signature area, which I think is the most promise in terms of new areas, which really hasn't been explored fully. Or even partially, I guess. But that's the area which I think would be really great. It's also used, it could also be used for things like consent, right? How does a patient consent? How does a provider consent to be queried? All of these kinds of things could be solved by effective use of certificates at the doctor level.
And I love that this conversation is touching on certificates and identity proofing and other components because, so often, Dan, people think of direct trust, and obviously we're a membership organization. We exist to be a gathering place for organizations like yours. And so often people think of us for direct secure messaging, and that's kind of it. But when you really look at direct secure messaging and the direct standard, it's all based on trust and how do we get to a trusted environment, and talking about some of those components, about the certificates, about the identity proofing. There are so many other opportunities to use them in healthcare and use these core concepts and really facilitate that trust further. And of course, it's something that Direct Trust is interested in. And we've been exploring other ways to further trust within healthcare, as you are well aware. So I think this has been a tremendous conversation for people to get more acquainted with how we got here, as well as some of the technical components at a very high level that make direct trust and direct secure messaging and the direct standard what it is today. And so with that, I am curious if you have any final thoughts or anything else that you want to leave with the audience today.
Thank you. And thanks again for this interview. Really appreciate that. The final thought I have is that standards have to evolve. Standards need to be living, breathing things just like everything else. Standards have to evolve for a couple of really big reasons. Number one is that not everyone is at the table when you design the standard. So there are things you don't know going in that people come in and educate you about later. There are other things where people want to use the standards in ways that you hadn't thought of when you started. And then the other big piece is that the whole universe changes all the time. So what you designed one day may not work at all the next day. And, just to kind of give you an evolution of standards for, the real world as we know it, right? The first binary standard for dealing with messages was basically Morse code, right? And you could think of the dots and dashes as each being a bit. So that was a 3-bit code. The next standard was the standard used for telegraphs. So the telegrams going across the country, first they started with Morse code, right? And then they switched to something called Baudot, which is a 5-bit standard, right? And then in the 60s, the American Standards Committee came up with this thing called ASCII, which is the 7-bit code that we all use today. So you can see how the knowledge of what you want to do to communicate information changes over time. And then, of course, as the world got smaller, as it were, we realized that, well, wait a minute, if you're doing a 7-bit thing that only gives you 2 to the 7th number of characters, but the Chinese character sets have more. So you now have 2-byte character sets, not just 1-byte character sets. So your basic knowledge of what goes on in the world changes. Hence, your standards have to change to go along with it. And it's true of X12, it's true of HL7, it's true of Direct Trust, it's true of all the groups have to constantly go back and revisit their standards to make them into what the needs are for today, not just tomorrow, but just even for today. So again, thank you very much, Catherine.
Sure, Dan, thank you so much. And I think that's a great point too, because that's why we still have the direct standard consensus body. They still meet, they still are working on items because of that evolution. So I think that's a wonderful point to end on. And again, congratulations on your recognition as an interoperability hero. Thank you for the work that you do in Direct Trust and the many other organizations that you're involved with in the interop and health IT space. And if you want to learn more about the Interoperability Hero Initiative or see other video spotlights like this, check out directtrust.org/interophero.